All right, so please welcome Amanda. She is a materials engineering major and going to be a third year of school. She is native of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She'll be telling the story of Patrick O'Donnell and the leprechaun. And she chose the story because it reminds her of her childhood as she remembers hearing the story when she was younger. And one of her favorite quotes is, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." And that was said by Maya Angelou.
In a land not too far from here, there once was a man named Patrick O'Donnell. Patrick lived alone, as no woman wanted to marry him. He was lazy and untidy, and he let his fences sag and his cattle roam the field, and his fields were filled with weeds. Patrick, even though his neighbors complained about his fields because theirs were nice and farmed, he preferred to dream. And he dreamed of the day where he would be rich, the day that a stroke of luck was going to happen to him. On this particular day, Patrick was headed to a feast in Hill. So he put on his only suit, and he put on his top hat, and lastly, he tied his red silk tie around his neck. And Patrick set out through his weed-filled fields on his way to Hill. He made a left and then a right, and then he walked down the hill. And when he got to the end of the hill, he realized that his shoe had come undone. So he stopped, and he tied his shoe, and he heard this sound. Tick, tack, tick. Was it the sound of a grasshopper? No. This sound was much louder and sharper. So he listened closely again. Tick, tack, tick. The sound rang louder. Patrick still couldn't figure out what the sound was. So he peered through the hedges, and he stumbled at the sight. He saw a tiny ferryman, and he had a red little hat and a white little feather and a black apron. And he was tinkering away at this tiny little shoe. Patrick, hearing old stories, he knew that this was a leprechaun. And he knew that leprechauns had a pot of gold that never emptied themselves. And that if he could catch the leprechaun would have to show him where his pot of gold was hidden. So Patrick, knowing this, excitedly ran through the hedges, but he heard a loud rip, and he looked down, and there was a hole in his pants. But he didn't really care, because he knew that if he had a pot of gold, that he'd be able to buy a new suit eventually. So he kept walking until he reached the clearing, and the leprechaun looked up, and he said, "Oh, hello, Patrick. Are you headed to the feast at Hill?" Patrick said, "Oh yes, I was headed to the feast, but then I saw you here working and I thought I'd watch for a bit." The leprechaun said, "You're welcome to watch. There's a rock right behind you if you'd like to sit down." Patrick almost turned to look, but Patrick was smart and he remembered the old stories, and he knew that if he looked away from the leprechaun, that the leprechaun would disappear. So Patrick stayed put, and he said, "That's a nice little shoe." The leprechaun replied, "Oh yes, I'm working on this shoe for the Queen of Fairies as she has her ball tonight." Even though this was the nicest shoe Patrick had ever seen, he said, "Well, it isn't the shoe I'm looking for." The leprechaun sighed. "I didn't think it was." Patrick then said, "No, indeed, I'm actually after your pot of gold." And the leprechaun said, "Pot of gold? Why do you think I'm sitting here working away while the whole world is feasting if I had a pot of gold?" And Patrick said, "Well, it's really none of my business why you're sitting here working while the whole world is feasting, but you are in my field and I want your pot of gold." And the leprechaun remarked, "A poor bit of field it is." And Patrick, he wasn't too happy about that, so he snatched up the leprechaun and he squeezed him hard. And he said, "The pot of gold, give me your pot of gold." And the leprechaun gasped for air, and he said, put me down, I can't breathe." But Patrick said, "I'm not going to let you down until you give me your pot of gold." So reluctantly, the leprechaun said, "Okay, I'll show you my pot of gold if you let me down." So Patrick let the leprechaun down in the grass, and the leprechaun walked over to a clump of ragweed in the field. He said, "If you dig under this clump, there's my pot of gold. But poor Patrick, he looked around and he couldn't find so much as a stick to dig up the gold. So he said, well, if I run back and grab a shovel, I won't be able to find my way back to your pot of gold. Leprechaun said, that's not my problem. I brought you to this clump and here's my gold, so it's your problem to get it back. So Patrick thought and he thought, and he came up with this brilliant idea. So he let out a big grin and he untied his red tie and he tied it around the clump of ragweed. As he said, if I go back, I'll be able to see the clump with my red scarf from far away. So the leprechaun laughed and he said, that's your plan? And Patrick said, well, do you promise not to remove my tie? And Leprechaun said, I promise. So Patrick ran back and the leprechaun disappeared into the night. So Patrick came home and he grabbed his shovel and then he ran back toward Balaka Hill. And he was laughing and he was humming on the way because he knew that this pot of gold was almost his. But about halfway toward Balaka Hill, he realized that every clump of ragweed in his field had the same red tie around it. And he screamed, that wicked leprechaun! Even if I live to be 100, I'll never have enough time to dig up all these clumps in the field. So Patrick stomped on home. And when he got home, he sat down to start sewing up his pants. Patrick, after that day, he realized that a stroke of luck like that was not gonna happen to him again. So he decided to clean up his act, and he cleaned up his fields, and he eventually got married. And he had kids, and he told those kids and their kids after that the story of him, the leprechaun, and the pot of gold.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Nice job. Beautiful telling.